Welcome to Being Human. I'm your host, Steve Cuss. On Being Human, we take a look at the dynamics that infect our well-being and our relationships. We focus on reactivity and triggers and coping mechanisms that get in the way of us being well with ourselves, well with our people, and also well with God. And most of the time we have a guest on the show, and today is no exception. I'm joined by Uli Chi. Uli Chi just recently wrote a book called The Wise Leader. And oh my goodness, as of the release of this episode, we are in such dire need of proper wisdom nowadays. Particularly those of us in North America, I think we find ourselves just trying to digest all of the news that is coming at us, particularly federal government news. And what we really need is wisdom and discernment. How do we know what to believe? How do we know what's true? How do we know what to care about and not care about? I really enjoyed this talk with Uli because the way he defines wisdom, I find so helpful. When I think of wisdom, I primarily think of information and knowledge. When Uli thinks of wisdom, he primarily thinks of relational well-being. It's right in line with this show. And so we get into the importance of relational connection. How do you know what's true? How do you figure out what's true? And Uli actually gives us some very concrete steps on determining how to navigate what's going on. So before we get to Uli, let me light the candle. It's just an opportunity to pause and relax into God's presence. Whatever's going on in your life right now, just to take a deeper than normal breath and remember that regardless of what is going on, God's with you. Uli Chi is the author of The Wise Leader. He made his name by being a software developer. He was actually very innovative in the world of virtual reality, built a 3D virtual reality software product, sold that company. He serves for Fuller Seminary. He's on many boards. Uli is known as quite the board and governance whisperer. There's a lot of reasons to listen to Uli, mostly because he's giving us a guide of wisdom. Let's tune in now. Uli, I've been really excited to have you on the show because it feels like we need guidance on wisdom more than ever. There's a lot of ways we can begin. I'm keen to get your take on, in today's day of saturated information, how do we figure out what is true and what is spin? How do we discern the news and information we're receiving?
Yeah, it's a great question. It seems to be the question of the hour, if not of the generation. Um, I think I think we begin by saying there is such a thing as objective truth, right? That there are things that are true and things that are not true, and that we don't get to make up our own facts about what's going on in the world. And I think again, acknowledging, we swim in a world of information, knowledge, and technical skill, and those are good things. I mean, I sometimes say, wisdom is not the same as that, but I begin by saying, objective truth matters. And I'm a technologist. I've spent most of my life in technology, and so information knowledge matters a lot, right, in terms of the kind of things you can create. And I was just reflecting on the fact that my wife last year was suffering from heart arrhythmia, where the heart doesn't beat normally. And for some people, it's not a big deal, but for her, it was a big deal. She went from being a very active person to one who was all of a sudden almost debilitated. And she was able to get what's called a cardiac ablation, where the heart rhythm is restored. And the truth is, 20 years ago, that kind of procedure wasn't even available. So, I'm very grateful for information, knowledge, and skill, right? And I think sometimes we play it down, we don't value it. But I think wisdom, in a certain sense, that's part of wisdom, being able to know what's true, how things work, and how to make things work well, and how to discover things that, perhaps didn't even exist before. But I think wisdom deals with larger questions, in terms of who are we meant to be as human beings? Why are we here? How are we to live in a way that leads to flourishing for people and for the planet? And I think part of the question, what is wise, is a question about what leads to flourishing, right? And what is it that leads to a society where we can flourish both individually as a community and for the planet to flourish. And I think it's pretty evident that we're not there. And a lot of people are arguing about what to do about it. But I think the reality is we need to be able to discern what contributes to flourishing. And I think in that sense, for me, and in my book, I talk about that wisdom is fundamentally about relationships. That it's about how we relate to God, how we relate to one another, and even how we relate to the planet, the culture, the world in which we inhabit. And maybe in a nutshell, you could define wisdom as love in action, right? So wisdom is in fact love expressed practically in the world. That's a very simple way of saying it, but it's infinitely complicated and nuanced. But I think that's a helpful place to start.
This is what I found I thought, helpful in your book, The Wise Leader, Uli, because when I naturally think of wisdom, I think information or thinking
Mm,
about ideas. But you really do frame wisdom through the lens of love as the primary reflection of wisdom.
right.
So you're just saying to us that wisdom is fundamentally about relationship. Could we talk about the average person on Facebook seeing a friend on Facebook posting something that's volatile, maybe it's politically volatile,
Mm,
and then seeing that the comments are devolving into more and more reactivity?
mm,
How does somebody not catch that? How do they stay wise in that
mm.
situation?
Yeah, it feels like we're all reacting to one another, and it's like a bunch of ping pong balls, right? Sort of,
Yeah.
or a nuclear reactor where there's no buffer. I think there's several things that I think that are helpful to me. I love one of my favorite poets is T.S. Eliot. One of his famous lines is "Teach us to care and not to care." And I think, in a strange way, that we care too much, right? We care about a lot of things, and related to that is we have such a sense of, I don't know what the right word is, responsibility, obligation to respond, that we forget that we're not God. God alone is God. Somebody once said, there is a God and you're not it. And so I think we forget that. And I think for a whole host of reasons, um, you know, and I've worked mostly and talked mostly about wisdom in the context of leadership, and particularly for leaders who are up front, who are in the public eye. People sort of expect them to be almost godlike, to be able to know everything and to do all the right things. And I think a healthy wisdom, biblical wisdom, basically says, we're not God. We have limitations. We can discern things, but it's not so easy as simply saying we know all the right answers. And I think to your question about social media, I think there's several things. I think one is just to recognize you don't have to respond to everything that's out there, right? I mean, I think there's a part of it that's self-regulation. I think some of us get addicted to social media. I tend not to. I do a little bit on LinkedIn, but not much. I think others maybe feel called to do that, which is wonderful. But I think we all have to be aware of what's going on inside of us as we're doing this, right? And we sometimes we care too much, to use T.S. Eliot's phrase. I think the other thing is, I think wisdom fundamentally requires us to treat the other people as persons, not as simple ideas. And they're made in the image of God, and that means fundamentally that God is not figure outable. I mean, we know things about him, but even persons, in my experience, persons are not figure outable. There's more to a person than whatever they've said or posted or said on most social media. So I think I begin by saying, um, people are more than their posts, their opinions, or even their ideology or theology. And so that leads me to a fundamental humility and curiosity about others. And I think we need to learn to try to understand what's behind things for people. And that's very difficult to do on social media. I mean, these are little snippets and so we've reduced ourselves to little snippets. And I hope we can all agree that we're more than the snippets, right? So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is I found that, and it's hard to do, is that we should acknowledge our differences, but we shouldn't focus on them. that we should appeal to our common humanity and our shared concerns. And it's hard to get to that, right? I mean, when the when when passions run deep and the concerns are very real. I mean, their issues are not insignificant that we're wrestling with, right, in the world. But it's worth remembering that we share a common humanity, and probably down underneath, there are things going on that we never get to that actually help us to be able to identify with one another. Maybe not to agree on the issue, but at least to understand that we are dealing with another human being. In my experience, I find that oftentimes there's sort of a rational and an emotional level of conversations, right? The rational conversation is about the debate about an issue. But often if you go underneath, you see, there's people have been wounded or there's something going on for them. And in us, when we react strongly to something, I think it's really important to pay attention to that.
Yeah,
Um,
I think that's a really helpful guide for people to realize that, okay, you think you're dealing on a rational level or what we might call a content level, the topic at
mm,
hand, but to learn to pay attention to the emotional subtext,
yeah.
reactivity,
Mm,
your need to be right, your need to have the last word, some of these things.
yeah.
Um, Uli, is part of the problem is how much we assume we know about the other person's motives when we really don't.
Yeah, no, I mean, just to give you a simple example, I say in the book that, I've been married for almost 50 years now to my wife, and she and I are very, very different people. I mean, I tell the story that at, at one point when our kids were grown, we were sort of trying to figure out what we were going to do with the rest of our lives, and we brought in a psychologist friend who gave us a battery of tests, personality tests. She said it'd be helpful for you to understand each other and a bit more. And so we did. And when we sat down, we were sitting around a coffee table, and she started to laugh, and she says, uh, I'm surprised you guys are still together. We were on every imaginable scale, right? So we are on opposite ends. And I think that makes communication difficult, right? I mean, it's just, I find oftentimes when I'm talking with her, um, that she'll stop me in mid sentence and say, you're not listening to what I'm saying. You know, you haven't heard a thing I've said, because I've already started in my head to figure out, now I know what this is about, and I'm starting to formulate the response. I'm assuming I know what she's talking about. And more often than not, she's right. And that was a very helpful, practical reminder to me that when I'm talking to people, we're talking to, it's helpful to remember people are mysteries. I mean, because they're made in the image, they're not definable, however we want to categorize them, that helps us try to understand them. It's not the whole thing. In the same way, our theology doesn't define God, right? I mean, God is God, and we try to understand who he is, but and our challenge is, in fact, to try to understand better who the other person is. And I think that's an ongoing conversation and discovery. And it's really easy to make assumptions about the other person. It's, you dig underneath and you discover that's not actually what they're talking about.
What's the opposite of wisdom? Is it foolishness? Is it something else?
Yeah, I think it's folly.
Folly. Yeah.
Right? There's wisdom and there's folly. And I think it's easy to, to wisdom isn't just, that's really an interesting way to frame it. I guess that folly is what leads to, if wisdom leads to life, if genuine wisdom leads to life, folly leads to the opposite of life, to death, to languishing as a community, right? So I think folly is the opposite of wisdom.
Yeah. And then, Dr. Henry Cloud had this incredible book, Necessary Endings. And,
Mm,
he's a clinical psychologist, and he talked about there's three types of people. There's wise people, fools, and evil people.
yeah.
And he paused in the chapter and he says, as a psychologist, I'm very uncomfortable with these labels. However, the Bible is comfortable labeling people this way. Um, what's your experience with dealing with evil?
Mm. Yeah. No. Yeah, I think that I think in my experience, I think this is where it gets tricky as a leader. On the one hand, you're trying to be loving and gracious, but I think that part of the job of leadership is to put up guardrails to contain things that are destructive for us individually and for the community as a whole. And sometimes you have to say no to people who are, who are not helpful to the community. I mean, I think in the worst case, and I've been fortunate. I don't know that I've had that many experiences where I've had to act with great power to contain evil. But I mean that's been the case, right? And there have been situations in history. The American Civil War is a good example where slavery was at issue, and we literally went to war, even though we didn't want to do that. Um, I hope that that's not, you know, those kinds of choices, thankfully, aren't facing us most of the time. But I think
Yeah.
in small and large ways, it's helpful to recognize, there are people who are out to do ill. That not everyone. We live in a moral world, but people get to choose whether to love or not to love, and those who don't, there are people who are opposed to life and flourishing, and we need to figure out how to respond. I think one of the challenges with that, Steve, is that, and this is why I think Jesus said, "Love your enemies," is that it's easy to become like our enemies, right? So, in the great danger of sort of meeting evil with force, which sometimes is necessary, is that we become evil ourselves. And I think, and Jesus said, pray for your enemies, um, and love them. And what that looks like, I think, is pretty open ended. And there's lots of examples in history where force was required. But I think the reality is God is reluctant to do it, and so should we be. Right? I think it's not our opening gambit, right, so to speak. Right? And
Yeah.
so I think being able to um, look for ways to make sure that we don't become like the very evil we're trying to oppose. As Paul would say, don't oppose evil with evil, oppose evil with good. You know, um, and I think sometimes Paul talks about heaping coals of fire on those people who are, and I wasn't quite sure. I think it's an ancient expression that's hard to translate. My closest to is kill them with kindness. Right? I think, and I've seen experiences in my own life, personally and in business, where I think rather than responding in kind, which is the natural tendency, is to do the very opposite, to be kind and generous, within boundaries. You don't just, throw away everything in the process. But I think more often than not, I think God uses that as a way to help move folks in the right direction.
I was really surprised in my own ministry when I was a lead pastor. I just had a handful of pretty harsh critics. They enjoyed coming after me and
Mm.
they kind of got their kicks out of kicking me around.
Yeah,
I'm not talking about people that just have an opinion. I'm
yeah,
not talking about people who they and I disagree on the direction of the church. Like those people are fine.
yeah,
Everyone's entitled to their opinion. They're entitled to share it with me. I don't need them to agree with me. I'm talking
right.
about the very small handful that just something else was going on early. They seem
Yeah,
to really delight in knocking me around.
yeah.
What you just shared, I just found it the surprising benefit to me of remembering that they are made in God's image
Mm.
was that I got hurt less when I met with them.
Mm.
I thought remembering that they were made in God's image kind of made me like the bigger man, if that makes
Mm.
sense. Like, well, I'm
Mm.
gonna be the bigger person. I'm gonna treat them with respect, regardless of how they treat me. But I wasn't expecting that. I walked away from those encounters much more at peace.
Mm.
How does that strike you when you hear that?
Yeah, I think that that's a really interesting experience, Steve, and I think that feels right to me. I think that in a certain sense, you realize that at least the way I hear that is they're not your problem to solve. I mean, in the sense of your job isn't to make them different. I think sometimes we feel obligated to fix people when that's not our job. It's part of not being God, right? And so I think it creates a sense of peace. Say, okay, that's who they are. We may need to just simply separate because that's not healthy to the community for them to be destructive. So you can take appropriate actions in a gracious way to say maybe you shouldn't be here, right? Um, but I think it creates the sense in which we don't know what the end of their story is, and how we contribute to the end of their story can be surprising. I think I remember reading the story of Manasseh in the Bible. In the story that in the story of in First and Second Kings, Manasseh is displayed is not displayed. He's narrated as the king who is sort of the worst of all possible people. And then in Chronicles, there's a different take on it. That is, at the end, Manasseh repents, and it's sort of saying that. Wait a minute, we're getting two different stories of this guy. But I think what Chronicles reminds me is that you just don't know, right? You just don't know how other people will turn out, and you don't have to be the agent of that, right? And that it creates a sense of a healthy emotional detachment of saying, we trust God to deal with them. What that looks like, how it's going to turn out, who am I to say, right?
Okay, so the reason I think the wise leader is such a helpful guide, especially Uli in 2025, where there's so much reactivity and spin going around, is because you help us frame wisdom. You're saying, okay, steward what you care about. There's too many things to care about, and be careful that you are not like running on empty, trying to care about too many things. I found that to be really
Right.
helpful. Of course, we all have to figure out how many things can we care about, and
Yes.
but that's still just a helpful frame to say that everything coming at you doesn't deserve equal amounts of care. The second, I think, nugget you give us is that wisdom is fundamentally relational, not about information and knowledge, remembering that the other person is made in God's image, worthy of dignity and respect. There's a couple of things, though, you wrote about that really surprised me. And one of them was you said wisdom generates delight.
Mm.
I love that. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, no, I think sometimes wisdom sounds like a really serious thing, right? In the
Yeah.
sense of, I think we just feel like. But I remember in the book I talk about my Chinese grandfather who loved to show me around his garden, and it was just such a delightful thing. And just even seeing the picture, which I have in the book, of him doing that with me is just brings a great sense of joy. I think wisdom is meant to be, if wisdom leads to flourishing, joy and delight is the end of flourishing, right? And so there's a wonderful text in Proverbs 8 about wisdom delighting in God's creation and playing. There's a sense of playfulness about wisdom. Um, and I think in my theological upbringing, I mean, I've tended to see God as a pretty serious person, you know. I, but I read a book by forgotten the author now, but it's called The Humor of Christ, and Eldon Trueblood. That's right.
Mm.
So he wrote back in the 1960s, and he just sort of traces in the Gospels Jesus' sense of humor in some of the parables and some of the stories he told. And we tend to think of him as, he's giving a serious talk about faith, and he is in one sense. But I think we sometimes miss the fact that there's a twinkle on Jesus' eye. He's talking about the camel going through the eye of a needle or something. It's sort of like that's really funny, actually. Sort
Yeah.
of kind of a funny story, and so we miss out on that. And I think there's a sense in which I think I think God has a wonderful sense of humor, and I think we sometimes get too serious. And I find just, I mean, as a practical matter, when I'm trying to, like when I was writing the book, sometimes I would get stuck. And so the thing I had to remind myself of was just play with this a little bit. Don't be, you're trying too hard to get from A to B, just allow your imagination to wander. I think playfulness and imagination, which I also talk about in the book, are, I think, deeply related. There's nothing like a kid playing and finding delight. Um, I quote G.K. Chesterton in the book where he says, we have sinned and grown old, and our Father is younger than we are. And there's a sense of delight. He's talking about this. God seems to delight in creating not just one flower, but millions of flowers over and over and over again. Where we might get bored, kids, just love it. The kids love the repetition. I have grandchildren. They just want to do it over and over. It's just so much fun. And as someone who's gotten older, it's easy to lose that sense of joy and delight in the simple things.
Yeah, I love that you're reminding us that the evidence of wisdom is playfulness. It's such a shocking, kind of jolting way to think about wisdom. because I do think we tend to get earnest, Uli, and the second section of this podcast, we're really wanting to focus on some themes for our audience, and I'm just going to name the themes and have you pick the ones you want to kick around with me a bit.
Sure.
But what we look at is the dynamics that infect our own well-being and our human relationships, and we have assumptions, reactivity, stuck predictable patterns that get us in trouble again and again, and then our own attempted solutions to those patterns. Um, I wonder if we might start with assumptions. I find assumptions really hard to notice in myself. Like they're just so assumed that
Mm.
I don't even know it's there. How have you been able to uncover some assumptions you hold that aren't true?
Well, I think by running into a brick wall. It's sort of like, I was talking about my wife saying, you haven't been listening to a thing I've said. It's sort of like, I think of myself as a pretty good listener and thoughtful and empathetic. And to be confronted with the fact, oh my gosh, um, and another good example from sort of my personal life is I think for a long time in our conversations, I came into the conversation sort of as the solver of problems. And she would, share with me an issue and whatever. And I would start going into problem solving mode, and it would rarely go well. you know? And
Yeah.
this went on for years. I mean, I wish I were wiser than perhaps others think that I am. But finally, I don't know exactly why, but finally I said, Jerry, so what would you really like from me? Do you want me just to listen, or do you want me to help you figure out the problem? And she says, oh, I just want you to listen. I'm sure other men have had that experience with their wives. But so I think one of the things I've tried, and as a really simple example of, the assumption, oftentimes these conversations, still today, even after 50 years, when she's sharing something she struggles with, it's my natural inclination to go into problem solving. So I've tried to remind myself, ask her what she wants, right? And sometimes she does want help, and there's a particular problem that needs help solving. But many times it's just sort of learning to listen and to try to get underneath, to figure out. Again, I was saying this earlier. I think she can describe a problem, but she doesn't necessarily always describe what's really bothering her underneath, right? It's the assumptions, even for her, that are part of the dynamic that we need to get to. So being able to process with her and ask her about, so what's behind this for you? Why do you feel this way? What's it about you, this that troubles you? So why is it so important to you? And that's a great question. I sometimes ask myself, why are you feeling so strongly about this?
Mm.
It doesn't, even sort of trying to look from a distance, it's easy to say, well, this isn't that big of a deal. Is it really? I mean, is it right? But actually it is somehow. And so what's going on underneath, I think, and that's related to your reactivity question, right? So why are you reacting this way?
Yeah.
And I think part of wisdom is trying to figure out what's going on underneath, right? To know ourselves, use Augustine's phrase, to know ourselves, as well as trying to know God, right? So,
Yeah. Okay, Uli. And then what kind of behaviors in other people tend to generate reactivity in you?
yeah. Wow, that's an interesting question. I haven't thought about that in those terms, but I think when people are passionate about something that I believe is wrong, and sort of are arrogant in the way they go about expressing it, I think when they are behaving in my way of describing it, unwisely, I tend to it's easy to react to that and say no, 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 and I find that um, so when there's both um, lack of wisdom and when there's clear sense of injustice somehow involved, then when people are you know taking advantage of those who are not don't have power themselves, I think it's easy for me to want to come to their rescue.
Okay. Before we get to the dreaded gauntlet, we have to ask you about your name.
Yeah.
You have such an unusual name, Uli Chi. Tell us about that.
Oh, yeah. Well, my my father's Chinese, which you might guess from the Chi part, and my mother is German, which you might or might not guess from Uli, which is a from the German word Ulrich. So I'm a product of two different cultures and living yet in a third one, right? So I was born in the Far East. We lived in Germany for a while, and we've settled here in the U.S. So I feel both at home and everywhere and nowhere, right? In a certain sense, right? There's a sense in which I've lived in between worlds as well as in the different worlds. So I think in many ways it's been a great blessing for me to. Um, I actually, this is part of the story. I guess I've English was my third language. I started speaking Mandarin, then I spoke German, and then I spoke English. And I was 10 years old when I came to the United States. So I was still young enough where changing languages wasn't terrifically difficult. But I think having had the perspectives of different cultures, I think has been really, really helpful for me.
Yeah.
And it's made me appreciate that wisdom exists in lots of different contexts, there's lots of different cultural contexts. Um, and I think just and maybe tying that to something about the book, Steve, I think one of the things that motivated me was I think one of the surprising things is that Christian wisdom has an unusual degree of requiring humility and curiosity. I think sometimes Christians and the tradition that I've grown up in, sort of we have clearly Jesus is God come incarnate, therefore the revelation of Jesus is, in a certain sense, final and definitive. And yet somehow Christian wisdom challenges us because we're not God, because God is, in a certain sense, always, there's more to know about him. Then we fundamentally have to have a posture of curiosity and humility in the way we look at the world. And I think having come from a multicultural context helps me a bit with that. I've seen wisdom in my grandfather, who was not a Christian, and yet in many ways exhibited many Christian traits. And I think we live in a world, I think, where there's such polarization, in particular, where our Christian brothers and sisters sometimes feel like our job is to, impose everything on everyone else and not to learn anything from others. I think we really have a chance to I think if we are truly to be wise in a Christian sense, I think we need to be able to discern God's wisdom everywhere. Just like all truth is God's truth, all wisdom is God's wisdom.
Uli, that's really striking that you moved to the United States when you were 10. You grew up in the Far East, also Germany, two wildly different cultures, and
Yeah,
then you come to the United States not knowing English. It's always fascinating to me when you're a kid, you don't know that something's unusual. You're just living your life, but then
yeah,
you look
right.
back on it as an adult. You look back at when you were 10. What did that make you think of as you look back now on those first couple of years in America, learning English, navigating this culture? What comes to mind for you?
Um, well, I mean, how remarkable. I mean, a couple things. One sort of a trite thing to say is, I learned by watching television, English by watching television. I learned English by watching Superman and Highway Patrol. Two shows that were, I mean, it's amazing how media can in fact shape, who we become. I think, and in that sense, I hope it was a relatively positive thing in terms of learning the language, at least. I think the other thing is just, I think, there's just there's just such a sense in which we are, when we're at that age, as I said, I was 10. I think that's a particular age where we're open to formation and we're adaptable in a way that becomes harder as we get older. I mean, I
Hmm.
notice in myself that as I've gotten older, you tend to get fixed in terms of how you look at the world. And I think both at that age and having had those very sort of distinct experiences moving into very different cultures, I think I think one of the things I've learned from that is learning to be curious
Hmm.
and to be, in a certain sense, in a healthy way, to be flexible, to be say we don't know always, right? And there's so much about the world and that we assume is a certain way that we don't, we aren't willing to consider other points of view. And I think one of the great gifts in the book I talk about, one of the gifts of wisdom is diversity, that God brings different cultures, different perspectives, and that we don't, to be truly wise means we have to be willing to listen to other perspectives. And that one of the great gifts is, many of the folks that we don't, you know, necessarily identify with or perhaps even agree with it about certain issues, have something important to say to our lives.
Hmm.
I don't know if that answers your question, but
Oh,
that's
it's
sort of what
wonderful.
it makes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Uli, you are a world renowned expert in virtual reality software. You work for the Max Dupree Leadership Center at Fuller Seminary, while likely at some point sitting on an Aeron chair that
Yes.
Max helped lead. You are known around the world as a governance board whisperer, navigating board and employee relationships. However, Uli, you have not yet successfully navigated the gauntlet of anxiety questions on being human. So, without
I
further ado,
I
we
have
have
not, and
four or
I'll
five
see how I
questions.
do. I
Yes.
may not be quite as good as you might think.
Well, I have great faith in you. These are rapid fire, so it's kind
Okay.
of cruel because the questions go deep, but we do ask for a briefer answer.
Sure.
Let me throw the first one your way. What is one way you treat others that if you started to treat yourself the same way, your life would be better?
I think I would pay more attention to what's going on inside me. I think I pay a lot of attention to others, but I think I don't do that as much with myself.
Okay. Oh, off to a great start. Where do you experience a gap between what you believe about God versus what you experience from God?
Yeah, I think I think oftentimes I experience what feels like God's absence when I would expect His presence, and that I know God is always present, but it doesn't feel that way.
Yeah. What's your next move, Uli, when you are grappling with the perceived absence of God? What's your next move after that?
I think I'm reminded. Um, I think I think that's where Scripture and the narrative of Scripture helps me remember that I'm not alone in that experience. Right? And then, in fact, it's simply reminding myself that God is present even when that, as Jesus Himself said, I'm with you always, right? And that the emotional dynamic of that isn't um, defining; it isn't the final word, and that the sometimes this isn't quite what you asked, but I think for me it's recognizing that my need for emotional comfort isn't always the most important thing. Sometimes I need to just feel alone for a while, and
Okay.
realize that God is still present there even when I don't feel it.
Yeah, I think it might have been Elizabeth Elliot that said sometimes the fear doesn't subside and you have to do it scared. I found that very helpful.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Okay. When the local church is at its best, what's something that it offers that you cannot get anywhere else?
Well, every Sunday I get to worship and sit with the folks who I normally would not associate with. So it's people who are, I have friends and some of them come to my church, but there are lots of folks that I would not normally associate with. And I think that's the church at its best.
Hmm. Last question, Uli. You've sailed through the gauntlet. When in your life lately have you felt most fully and completely loved?
We have three grandchildren who are ages 2 to 6, and they live nearby. And when they come to our door, they run into my arms, yell, Papa, Papa, Papa. And some of them say, I love you. And I get this big hug, and I feel, the sense of unbridled enthusiasm and joy at seeing me. It reminds me of the story of the prodigal son where the father runs towards the son. And so I've learned from my grandchildren, strangely enough, that kind of love.
My guest has been Uli Chi, the author of The Wise Leader. Hard to think of a more timely book nowadays. We are in dire need of wisdom. We have such a deficit in our interactions nowadays. As I mentioned in the introduction, Uli comes by his wisdom the hard way. He has had such a breadth and depth of experience in so many different endeavors. I just commend Uli and his book to you. Uli, thanks for coming on Being Human.
Thank you so much, Steve. It's a joy to be with you.